Welcome back, everyone. Pal Ponder All Weather here. In this update, we're going to be taking a look at some of the longer term trends as we transition into a La Nina as we get deeper into fall and especially into the winter months. And what exactly does that look like going forward? If we start off and take a look at the overall sea surface temperature anomalies for the last 7 days here and the change, and that continues to cool off out there into the equatorial Pacific. So we are continuing on that trend as we transition out of ENSO neutral, where we currently are in now, into a La Nina, especially as we head into the winter months. So if we take a look at the trend over the last 3 months, this is from June the 25th. And if you recall, we came out of El Nino effectively on June the 8th. We had a very active spring storm season with all the tornadoes and very wet across a good part of the country. Now it's tried to dry out. We are in a kind of an ENSO neutral type setup, but you can see the trend as we get deeper into fall and especially heading towards winter. We are on that trend. Even though we are not meeting the criteria officially, we are definitely well on our way to classify as yet another La Nina as we get deeper, especially as we transition into winter. And this is what it would likely look like as we transition into the winter months starting in December. And typically you have a little bit more less active subtropical jet stream. So these waters are fairly cool out here in the equatorial Pacific. So this subtropical jet just becomes a lot less active because storms don't really like cooler air. So overall, this kind of favors the southern branch to have less active and drier activity across the southern tier of the United States. But it's the northern branch, it's the polar jet that likely becomes a lot more active, where you start to see a lot wetter conditions start to move into the Pacific Northwest across the northern branch as we transition into those winter months. We're not there yet, but I think this is where we're going to, and we'll have more shots. And I think parts of the Ohio Valley will start to turn wetter, even though they are drier right now. They'll make that transition to more of a wetter type pattern as we get into those winter months. So where we stand right now on the drought index, you can kind of see, overall, I think this area up here in the Pacific Northwest and much of Idaho and Montana back into Wyoming through the Dakotas, even though they overall drier at the moment, I do feel that's going to become a lot wetter as we get into those December, January, and February type months. And especially for those areas across the Ohio Valley where they desperately need the rain right now, into West Virginia, into Ohio, I think you're going to be really getting helped out with the drought as we transition into the winter months. But it's the southern branch here into California where I think they actually go back into another drought for them. And these areas across the southern branch through the Four Corners regions, much of Texas would likely deepen into a more significant drought. And those areas across the southeast, right now, they're getting a little bit more influenced by hurricane season, but obviously that will be ending in November. So by the time we start into those winter months in December, they won't be influenced by any storms that will be hitting the East Coast that will help with the rainfall that's helping out right now. But right now, let's talk about what's going on currently. And yes, we are in an omega block type pattern, as of right now. That's what set the stage for that storm yesterday that just dumped excessive amount of rainfall, over 20 inches in portions of North Carolina. And then we're finally cooling off, even though it will likely be brief. I think today's the day they actually break the streak of 113 days in a row in Phoenix not getting 100 degrees. So even though this is a brief cool down for much of the West, I do feel that there's going to be a welcome sight. But it's just the middle of the part of the country where we have more of kind of an omega block type pattern coming in. We have another ridge going to be building back into Texas, and those heat levels start to rise in a big way. But what happens is this ridge forms over the top in Canada, and that likely helps lower the pressures underneath. So even though we didn't officially get a named storm yesterday, even though we did have 50-mile-per-hour winds and some 20-inch rainfall totals, we never really had a closed loans. So we never was able to finish, officially go to Helene. But going forward with the more of a mega block, and some of the ensembles are starting to hint at the Caribbean in about a week time frame, we could be looking at another formation of possible another tropical system form into the Western Caribbean and possibly lift up into the Gulf of Mexico. So if we transition into some of the ensemble members of the European guidance over the next 10 days, even though we don't really officially have anything currently right now from the National Hurricane Center, I think they really will be putting out a yellow spot on here for over the next day or two, because a lot of ensemble guidances are starting to come together. We could be having a lot lower pressures with favorable activity over the top in the U.S. to lower the pressures underneath into the Caribbean. And with the jet stream, I think it gets a lot more active, especially as we head into next week, and more enhanced. And that will be traveling pretty fast. This has the capability of going into the Gulf of Mexico and likely pushed into portions of Florida, or likely even the East Coast. Right now, the GFS ensemble kind of implies more of a Florida push, or even off the East Coast, with the enhancement of that Pacific jet that I'll show you, that'll be screaming from west to east, being so fast, more of a zonal flow type shape. It could be enough to even push this system well out into the keep out into the open waters. And here's the jet stream, what we're talking about as we head into this weekend, going into that first official day of fall. Man, this jet streak is going to be screaming. So we do have an enhanced Pacific jet. That's typically a warm flow that's coming off the Pacific and very fast. It's hard to produce any cold intrusions, cold air masses coming down with more of this type setup within more of an enhanced Pacific jet. I think we're going to have into much of next week. And as we transition into much of next week, it's going to look like this, folks. Yeah, it's going to be plenty warm probably for the first week of fall for a good part of the lower 48. And we are also looking at the ensembles as far as precipitation, definitely favoring more of an eastward trajectory. So these areas likely have to be on the lookout for whatever might be to come out of here into the tropics, down here to the Caribbean as we head into next week. Anywhere from the New Orleans region to Mobile, to especially into Florida, getting into Georgia, much of the Carolinas again, and heading up the East Coast. And the GFS implies kind of the same thing. So what happens going forward? As of right now, we actually had a fairly weak polar vortex for this early on in the season. It actually produced some snows into Central Europe, out into some of the mountain ranges. But as we get deeper going into that October timeframe, it does somewhat modify. So I do feel by the time it actually circles back around again and gets to the US, we are going to have a cold shot, but it's probably not going to be nearly as cold as if it happened actually right now, versus what it might look like is going to happen into that second, possibly week of October. So yeah, we did have a pretty significant snow. Now granted, this is some of the higher elevations in Austria, but man, it's a pretty significant historic snow and big time snows in some of the mountain regions, and they had flooding rains and further south as some of the lower elevations. But that was compliments of that weak polar vortex at the time last week that we saw these big snows come to fruition. So what happens going forward as that weak polar vortex transitions to more of an average, and the MJO likely comes back down again? That's not saying much, because I do feel we are going to be staying warm on the warmer side for the next couple of weeks, but we are looking at more of a guidance that we could have a fairly decent cold shot coming in that second week of October, and pushing those temperatures down, as we get into that, that second half of the month of October. And it would likely bring some mountain snows across a good part of British Columbia, back into Idaho and Montana, but especially into Wyoming and to Colorado. Again, I do feel this is more of a kind of a higher elevation event, but we are looking at a little bit of a cold shot probably into that second week of October. But overall, looking at the kind of the finer details and more of the trends as we transition into fall with that October, November, December type, temperature anomalies, kind of looks like this, right? I mean, we're looking at, we could have some cold intrusions coming down every once in a while, but I do feel they're going to be modified and likely not going to be lasting for any given time. So overall, with a less active subtropical jet stream, these areas across the Four Corners regions, New Mexico, and much of the south central states, getting into the southeast and up the eastern seaboard would likely favor above average temperatures overall for the next 3 months. While we are going to have some cold shots at times, would likely favor, as these ups and downs come to fruitions, would likely favor probably equal chances of staying somewhat neutral or slightly below average or slightly above average. So I do feel we're going to have some cold shots, and especially these areas across the Pacific Northwest and our northern tier states are going to be favoring a little bit on the cooler side, while much of the southern tier states are going to be favoring with that less active subtropical jet on the above average, if not some parts of well above average. And as far as the precipitation goes, with the less active subtropical jet, it definitely feels like these areas across the Four Corners regions, much of California, getting into Texas and Oklahoma and portions of the southern, central and southern and central parts of the plains here would likely favor below average precipitation. And then as we transition out of that enso neutral and get into that La Nina type pattern, it does favor a little bit more active polar jet. So we'll have these systems come in off the Aleutian Islands, does favor above average precipitation. So that's the northern branch I do feel is going to turn wetter, over time. And this will be a lot more active continuing across the upper Great Lakes and a good part of the Northeast for that October, November, December months. And as we transition into that full-fledged La Nina going into those winter months, I think this pattern just gets a little bit more amplified as far as like La Nina goes. The subtropical jet will be alive and well by then, which would imply we still get these cold shots from time to time, but they'll be less over time, and the warm-ups are going to last a lot longer than the cool downs the further south you go. So even though, yes, we could have some colder Arctic intrusions at times, overall it's going to be favoring above average temperatures for a good part of the south, much of the southeast, and a good part of the mid-Atlantic, and much of the northeast as well, while much of the Pacific Northwest and the northwestern regions would likely favor below average temperatures, because you'll still have those cold shots, but they'll last a lot longer. And overall, I do feel it'll be overall on the colder side, with more cold intrusions for those northern tiers, more Arctic blast, more Arctic intrusions across the upper Great Lakes, the north central states, the UP of Michigan. Those areas would likely favor below average temperatures overall, while much of the mid-Atlantic and a good part of the Northeast would favor above average temperatures. And as far as the precipitation goes, with the La Nina likely in full-fledged by then, even though it looks to be weak on the weaker side, I do feel the less active subtropical jet is really going to be taking its toll, and the drought will only deepen for those areas across California and a good part of the Southwest and much of the South Central states and the Southeast as well, while much of the Pacific Northwest, the drought is going to be eroding over time, and a good part of the UP of Michigan and the Ohio Valley as well will also favor that above average precipitation. So I don't really think this gets going and more amplified until the winter months. So yes, these areas are in desperate need of rainfall currently at the moment, but I do feel over the next 6 weeks or so, we're going to be making that transition. And by the time we get through the winter months, most of these areas, if not, will be almost eroding that drought completely, where you actually see the above average precipitation at the moment. So guys, I appreciate you guys watching. Do like this video, definitely hit the subscribe button, and catch my next update while I protect you before and after the storm.